Hi everyone. So my name is Mikko, and I'll be talking about securing the win, which is essentially a lecture on winning strategies and mindsets, as well as practical advice on winning debates. I'm doing this through Mobile Matter, which I think is a great initiative in making debating more accessible. And essentially, what I want to talk about in this lecture is just, I think there are many things that we end up focusing on debating rather, that might lead against winning, even if that is our objective. We have cognitive biases and things in our brains that kind of tell us to do otherwise. So this is going to be a way to check against those, as well as to give practical advice in trying to achieve that. So there are going to be a few parts of this lecture. First is just some overall observations about debating and reasons why I think debating, which can be a very complex activity, distracts you in many different ways and makes it difficult to try and achieve the goal of winning. Second is just some starting tips. Third is winning with a case. So in 15 minutes, 30 minutes time, what should you be constructing in order to come up with a good case? Lastly is winning with adjustments, meaning sometimes you don't have a perfect case. And then 15 minutes, 30 minutes, you can make mistakes. How do you adjust and evolve, especially in a format, I'd say like Asians, where you have so many opportunities to adapt, but more so I think in BP, if you're like closing opposition, you really need to work on these adjustments rather than just stick to what you had in prep time. All right, so some observations about debating. And I think debating is mathematically an exercise in constrained optimization, which is to say that this is supposed to be 3 opponents, so maybe not the most mathematical slide, but you have 3 opponents in 7 minutes. I think that you could probably win any debate if you were given like 20 minutes, right? It's so easy to outline everything that could possibly win you around. But you don't have 20 minutes and you have 7, which means that there are so many mistakes that you can make or things that just might not be possible in 7 minutes time without speaking like a machine gun. So you are constrained by time, first and foremost, not just insofar as you have 7 minutes, but you have to prioritize and allocate that 7 minutes. But sometimes there's a round winning argument that you didn't spend enough time proving, or a really maybe very believable argument that you didn't frame enough to be very important. And I think these are the main things you want to be considering when you're making a good case, right? You want to first make sure it's believable, i.e., are you proving it well enough? And does it have enough real world basis for judges to think, okay, this could happen, I see it, it's an impact, right? Second is just impact. How impactful is the case, right? So even if you prove it, what does it do? How big is it? What's going to happen next? And what is the end outcome you want to achieve? There is responsiveness and weighing, which is, I think, more of the adjustments. So you want a case that doesn't just stand on its own, but given contestation from other teams, you'd be likely to maybe disprove them as well, or explain why your arguments are more important. And unique to BP debating is novelty. So you can have a winning case, but if it's the same as your opening governments, you lose the debate, right? I don't think your goal is to win in all these metrics. I think your goal is to explain why your strengths are greater than your weaknesses, and being able to pinpoint your strengths is greater than your opponent's strengths as well, and your weaknesses is lesser than their weaknesses. I think, again, in 7 minutes, it's impossible, I think, or at least incredibly difficult to come up with a perfect speech that has everything. If you can do that, wonderful. You don't need this lecture. But in the many instances where you can't, and I'd say even the best debaters in the world will lack 1 or 2 things, sometimes to varying extents, in these kinds of arguments. You want to be able to adjust in that instance. But I want to note as well that it's a two-way process, because I think a lot of people lean more towards you come up with possible arguments and then you develop a strategy around these arguments, rather than sometimes coming up with a strategy, i.e., I have to break this deadlock, or I have to disprove this, or I need to come up with a reason that something is going to be true, and then making that the case, right? So it has to go both ways. Sometimes you come up with stuff, and that's definitely important, and then strategize around it. But sometimes you don't have the argument quite yet, or you don't know what you're going to prove. You come up with a strategy first, and then fill in the details after. Having a good awareness of both, I think, is very important, because when your case comes first and then you just try and strategically rationalize it, you might not be coming up with the most important strategy. And obviously, if strategy comes first and then you don't have the case, then things might fall through, or it's just not very believable, even if it's strategic. So you have to be able to have a sense of both, being able to mix the two and allowing both instincts to come to play. And I think like a lot of speakers, including myself, forget they are trying to win. And that isn't to say they don't want to win, but that there are many things that kind of skew you away from the goal of trying to win. And there are many reasons for that. The first is just case attachment, meaning you kind of came up with like a case for like 15 minutes, maybe more if you're in closing half. It's hard to let go of it. Like, let's say your opening takes 80% of that case, you're left with 20%. That 20% is still going to be new, but is it going to be winning? Maybe not. But because you spent so much time on it, there's a bit of a sunk cost fallacy going on there sometimes. At least I noticed that for myself. But you kind of want to stick with it, right? And that isn't to say that when something isn't entirely new, you should just drop it. But it is to say you have to have an objective assessment of whether or not what is remaining is still important. And I think that is also true for things like if it's your field of study and you want to be able to insert it because maybe it's your thesis or some kind of research you've been doing, or I don't know, it's a really fun, really cool, really clever argument you've come up with, but might not be so applicable to the debate. You kind of still have that attachment and you want to run it. You have to be able to say no to yourself or prioritize other things. Second is for the sake of debating, which I think is you understand what you should be doing, right? And almost all tournaments, you come up with a speaker like a speaker briefing that tells you what each role should be doing. But I think sometimes because you have such a good idea of what your role should be doing, you don't understand why your role should be doing that. You just know you should be. I.e., I see a lot of rebuttals that try to disprove the other speaker, and they do, but they don't explain why did you have to do that? What did disproving that claim end up doing for the round? But because maybe this person was a whip speaker, they knew I have to rebut, I should rebut, and then implicitly just kind of tells, why that rebuttal is important to themselves because they ended up rebutting them. Basically, it's the fulfillment of your roles without a full understanding of those roles. And without fully elucidating to the judge, here are all the reasons that response wins us the debate. Sometimes it kind of diminishes the value of your contribution. The third is just listening. And it goes two ways, right? I think a lot of people don't listen to their opponents. And I think it is very, very good debating to give your opponents a lot of credence. I.e., obviously, you don't want to give them more than they deserve because you might lose on, something that isn't true. But I think you don't want to misrepresent your opponents either. So saying that they didn't prove something, they didn't respond to something, I think all will lead you to not doing as well because you failed to adjust to their adjustments. But also, I think it's listening to your partner. There are some times when your partner says something and you might not have thought that they would say it, and then you end up running it again. And that's not a harm, but it might be a waste of time. Or your partner misses like some kind of material that you discussed in prep and you have to explain it yourself at like second or third speaker. And then you don't because you assume that it was going to be said. I understand in debating, it's very hard to listen and think at the same time. But I think definitely some kind of mix of the two and not fully listening, all the time. But at the same time, having a good idea of where the speaker is in the speech. Very, very helpful. Fourth, speaks. From my personal experience, I used to concern myself a lot with speaks. And I would feel bad when I wouldn't speak very high. What I did at that time was to stop looking at the tab. Genuinely went on for tournaments. Perhaps, yeah, no, I think sometimes even until now, I don't look at it as often as I used to before. Because I think when you're speaking for the speaks, you kind of forget that speaks will reward you for trying to win the debate rather than maybe being the most flashy speaker, trying to do the most things, being, I don't know, whatever conceptions of good speakers are, rather than just trying to win the debate and providing that kind of value. I feel like it might harm you and your ability to win when you try and pursue that kind of individualistic goal. It also, I feel, is sometimes counterintuitive. Lastly is trust. And I think what I'm trying to say here is that sometimes with your partner, you maybe think that, especially I noticed for when I'm judging pro-ams, for example, they didn't get some kind of material out or they didn't explain it well enough. You have to keep a good ear on that, but you also do have to assume that they do well enough and that you can trust them. So personally for me, I've transitioned to deputy recently, and I trust my partner quite a lot in getting a lot of material out because what I end up doing is I adjust. Meaning, if they have proven something, I will not repeat that proof. I will assume they have proven it and then explain maybe why their proof was better, add some kind of new impact, etc. But if I were a bit more distrusting, I might try to rebuild the argument myself and prove it better. I think that kind of approach doesn't allow you to expand and evolve the case as much as you would like to be able to. So I think having that kind of trust when applicable, it's very, very important skill that you would have to learn in being able to win a debate. Lastly is I think people, I actually am not sure if this is the last slide, but I presume it is. The people often forget that judges are human. They're not going to track every single line of analysis. Very complex arguments might need more handholding. Sentences can be interpreted very differently. And I think that's why having very precise language, ones that you cannot misinterpret, or ones that people have a common understanding of, I think is a very underrated skill in debating. I've seen so many arguments made that were excellent, but interpreted differently, not in my opinion for the fault of the judge, because they were instead the fault of the speaker for not being able to, I suppose, create a greater amount of common understanding in the debate. Your goal is to say, here's the picture I have in my head. I want it in your head. When you use vaguer words, especially ones that might seem more like convoluted or highfalutin, it might kind of differ in terms of what you end up conveying to the judge as a consequence. Some helpful tips, because I do think we fall into a lot of cognitive biases in our monkey brains. The first is to let go of templates, because I think templates are like training wheels. They help you understand what is expected of a speech. They also slow you down. And a bike is capable of much more when you don't have the training wheels on. And I think your speech should be structured more so around strategy, meaning when you have a template, I used to personally think a first speaker has to have first argument principle, second argument pragmatic. And that helped me a lot. But at some point I hit a wall and I was like, why isn't this working anymore? That's because with that improvement, I was also hitting tougher rooms where perhaps the principle wasn't the most important thing, or I could have run a third argument in lieu of everything, or perhaps having an incredibly well argued principle was the most important thing in the round. There are emotions, circumstances where all of these things are going to change. When you have a template, that kind of leads you against adaptation. And I think asking yourself, what is the most important thing I have to do right now, is the template I use. Because if, for example, the opponent is focusing so heavy on the principle, either if I have a compelling counter principle that would disprove theirs, I would argue that. Or I would frame out the principle and introduce a pragmatic that might achieve it as well, or might be better than their principle. I would do that instead. And that depends, right? It depends on what I have. It depends on how well they argued it. And it depends on what my partner's already argued. So being able to work around these considerations rather than specific templates, I think perhaps are the next goal. If you're starting out and you're having difficulty making sense of everything, go ahead, use a template, like no judgment. I think at some point though, you have to take off the training wheels, because training wheels do help you become more comfortable with biking. And try to go for more, I suppose. If you want to go slowly, you can make templates for different situations. So sometimes you want to make a template for, if you're whipping and you have 3 really strong teams, how should you go about the template? If you're whipping and you don't really plan on specifically disproving the other teams, but maybe just weighing your extension against other teams, maybe you should have a template for that. If you are going first and you want a template for when you have so many different arguments, maybe 3 or 4, maybe make one for that, and then one for when you're going with a solid 2 arguments that are well proven, well concluded, well framed. Second is prep to win. Again, you want to prep a strategy. You want to enter the debate and justify your victory. I think especially, and I say this a lot, in a member speech, the first minute of it's going to make it or break it, right? A lot of judges might write you off. A lot of the time it might be difficult to understand where you're going. So having that solid first minute and justifying your entry into the debate, I think is very important. So you have to prep that strategy. But more than that, you want to prep backup plans, especially at closing. At opening, you want to prioritize the case, but you want to consider all the responses the other side could bring to it. So what I personally do is, once, say we're OG, I find DPM very difficult because you don't have very much time at all. Then you first hear the case, like at 7 minutes of LO, and you're just like, what do I do now? So what I personally do is when my partner is speaking, I think of all the possible op arguments. I will write them down and come up with responses. And I'm exaggerating. I can't do all of them, but definitely the most intuitive ones, the ones I can think of at that moment. So in my partner's 7 minutes of speech, I have a few rebuttals, right? If LO is going to say something, don't I'm not telling you to pre-write your rebuttals and predict the debate. I'm telling you to have some kind of things ready. Because if LO says something that is very close to what you have predicted, you would want to run that. But two things. One is you want to make room for adjustments. So if there's an additional nuance you missed in the argument you were preempting that LO introduces, say what that nuance is, include it and rebut it. If LO doesn't say it, it's the second thing. Drop it, right? You worked hard in it, whatever. Who cares, right? They didn't say it. Doesn't matter in the round. Or if you think that they should have run it, perhaps you would want to say it because that is preparation for CO, who's probably thinking maybe they should have run this, right? And definitely don't overbuild it because you don't want to be building against nothing. But if maybe CO raises a POI, or if you think it is a logical extension of the argument from op and a possible thing BLO could say, you want to get ready for it. But also, at closing, you want to assess which arguments your opening is likely to take, and you want to prep the strategy of weighing against it as well. Admittedly, and it feels a bit, I don't know how to say it, inauthentic, but I think one thing I do a lot at closing is, let's say I have argument A and argument B, right? And I'm thinking opening will probably only take one of argument A or argument B, but I don't know which one. So what I would do sometimes is I would have a line, or rather some justification of why argument A is more important than argument B, and a justification of why argument B is more important than argument A. And if opening takes argument A, I'll take argument B and explain why argument B is more important than argument A. And if they take argument B, I'll take argument A and explain why argument A is more important than argument B. And you're often giving incredibly contradictory reasons when you're doing this, but obviously you don't want to say both. So you want to just prep that strategy and then commit and stick to one. 3 is adjust to your opponent's world. I think a lot of debates, especially in Asians, end up becoming parallel because there are quite compelling harms and benefits on both sides, but a disagreement on the world in which the debate operates. So I honestly think a lot of it is prep or case bias. Or you spent 30 minutes talking to your teammates about this, you have a very strong idea that this is what the world should look like. And you have to do 2 things to adjust. 1, prove which world is more likely. Rather than just proving here the outcomes in our world, prove here is why our conception of the world is more likely than their conception of the world. But second is you debate an opponent's world. I remember I had a very, very good debate against, I think, what I thought was a very, very strong opposing team. And the motion was something about this house supports that girl, that girl trend on TikTok, which is basically girls that are pretty much saying they can do it all. So they wake up really early in the morning, they do all of their routines, they eat healthy, they take care of themselves, they're productive at work, they journal at the end of the day, they meditate, that kind of stuff. And I think OG had a lot of compelling reasons as to why this is going to be very accessible, why the advice is going to be quite good, why they're not likely to cause insecurity, etc. The way I thought I had to adjust to that was not to just continuously disprove them and say, no, 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 here's what they'll actually be like. They're going to cause more insecurity, etc. But instead was to say, you know what, let's say all of what they're saying is true. We don't care. We'd much rather people use TikTok as a form of escape rather than as a form of confrontation of their own daily lives. So if you do it to watch funny content, to watch cute cat videos, that is preferable than to having to confront ways in which you could potentially make your life better. And I don't want to get into the specific argument, but note that framing where I was just committed to weighing and adjusting to their world, I think then was the strongest thing to do because I thought they had very compelling reasons to prove their side of the house. 4th is add new content. Because again, you need to trust what has been said has been said. So when you're speaking second or you're rebutting, I think it honestly wastes quite a lot of time to repeat what either your teammate had already proven or to repeat what your opponent had said. Especially, I've seen speakers rebut a claim and they spend so much time explaining what the opposing team's claim was. Definitely, you want to do it justice. Don't rebut a fictionalized version of it or a misrepresented version of it. But you also, I think, want to do it very succinctly because I think that just takes up a lot of time. But especially, I think in reconstructing your partner's case, maybe you just reference some reasons, right? Maybe they give long lines of analysis. Maybe say the first reason was on this concept, the second was on this concept, the third was on this other concept, right? But secondly, is that you don't always need to add a new argument, right? I'm not saying add a new argument, right? What I'm saying is when there's already been an argument given by your partner, you want to add a contribution that makes the argument better. So explaining why responses from the other side don't disprove your partner's argument. So maybe they missed the nuance, maybe they're misconstruing it, etc. Explaining further impacts of the argument. So explaining here's another field where this could be important. Here's another aspect that this is, crucial. Thirdly is explaining new framing for the argument. So why is it outframed? Perhaps new material that came out from the other team. So these are all things that are much quicker to do and more important if your argument has already been proven by a partner rather than trying to add an entirely new substantive concept. Fifth is adjust as necessary. So from your partner, know when to back the case up, or if you've messed up in prep, know when to pivot. But I want to make clear, do not drop your partner. Do not say, my partner was wrong, I'll fix it. What you want to say is, here's a logically derivative thing from what my partner had said. Here's how it adjusts to the other side. Or pin it on the other side and say, you know what, we'll give them everything, let's adjust. Rather than saying, my partner didn't account for this. Not only do I think it's rude, but I also think you could potentially be diminishing what is still a strong part of the case and that you don't want to give it up. Second is the case. You want to be very honest in admitting your extension has gone to your partner. I remember I did in a tournament a few months ago where basically our opening team took everything. And I basically told my partner, we have nothing. Can you just send as much stuff you can think of? I will try to make a coherent case out of all of this. We ended up winning the round just because if I stuck to my initial thought and then thought, there's still extension, we can still push this on, probably wouldn't have worked. But when I told my partner, he gave a lot of really good new material that I was like, okay, this is how we're going to enter at this point now. Because sometimes your partner, especially if you're a member and they're whipping, they're thinking of responses, not constructives. And you need to say, look, I need help. Let's construct together. Last is the priority. So the winning team is not necessarily the most reputable team. The strongest speaker might be the one right before you, even if you've already had your speech pretty much written up. You want to make sure that as the round progresses, you are changing what priority of team you are going to rebut, what issue you think is the most important, what is currently mattering the most in the day. Winning with your case. So how do you win in prep time? The first thing is you want to be comparative at everything. And that isn't to say that I think modern debating isn't comparative. I actually think modern debating is very comparative. I just think it has to be comparative in more aspects. I think that especially in the bread, what I'm saying here is that sometimes I think the conception of being comparative is that it's a sandwich. You have a problem, you solve it by using comparative mechanisms. Like here's our solution, here's their solution, our solution is better. And then you reach the same conclusion. When I think a lot of the time, you can have comparative everything. You can have a comparative problem and a comparative conclusion. What do I mean by that? Let's say you have the motion, this house would defund the police rather than reform it. I think a lot of teams will obviously bring up police brutality, racial bias, a lack of justice. And I think these are definitely the most important problems you have to solve in the debate. But I think a solution that you propose cannot simply say, here are the problems, here's how our solution solves them. You have to identify what are the problems that are uniquely only can be solved by a solution. So you have to identify parts of the problem that only one side can possibly solve. What do I mean? Let's say in this motion, you have to explain what is inherent to the policing system that you cannot possibly reform such that you need to defund it. And I think given that, it is much stronger than saying defunding the police is better than reforming it. Because when you introduce problems that are endemic to the system, then reform cannot possibly occur. That therefore makes the solution of defunding far more compelling. For example, I think there's a problem of how to measure the performance of a police department. And no matter how much you reform it, it is unclear how you can measure that performance and provide incentives in ways that are good. And I think a lot of the time, police departments are mired in bureaucracy, and there is no clear reform or solution that is going to solve that. So, for example, any metric of measuring police performance, I think, would lead to bad incentives. If you say more arrests is good from a police department, you're going to have more unjust arrests. So, arrested on petty crimes, classifying crimes wrongly, accusing people of crimes they didn't commit through self-incrimination, all that kind of stuff. If you say more arrests good, you will have more arrests that are unjust. But let's say, you know what, let's do lower crime rates instead. Then you'll have underreporting of crime. So it's the opposite problem, right? Now you're less likely to arrest, less likely to like write someone up for a crime they've committed because you want to look like a better police department because you've lowered crime rates from before. So in those instances, it then becomes very unclear. How do you know you're doing well as a police department? I actually personally don't know the answer to that because there is no easy solution being able to conceive of a metric for a police department. And perhaps any other solution that you would propose, most proponents of defunding would say, let's have experts in de-escalation, let's have more medical solutions for things like the drug problem. These are much more benign, in fact, probably quite positive incentives to perform well, right? So if your metric is instead how many people you've helped rehabilitate, it's, I guess, personally for me, it's not clear how that could possibly go wrong versus one that is based on deterrence and arrests. Or the monopoly on violence in its relationship with protection from the law. Because when the police have more immunity, such as qualified immunity that exists now, you're more likely to abuse that. You are more likely to act out. You are more likely to know the law will protect you. But when you have less immunity, it's more likely the police are endangered because they are admittedly still operating in very intense, perhaps situations where there's a violent criminal involved, where if they're harassed, distracted, or they are fearing harm from citizens, they could act out. Maybe not because they know they have the protection of the law, but because they are in fear of their own lives. So in those instances, it becomes very difficult. And that's not because of a reform you could do. It's because of the monopoly on violence that they hold. Because when you have a violent solution, because they can do things like arrest, they can beat you, they can knock you down, it becomes very difficult to find out what are the right incentives you can provide to ensure this isn't abused. If you protect them, they can abuse it out of a sheer amount of power. If you fail to protect them, they could abuse or rather become more violent as a result of the uncertainty and insecurity towards their own lives. Comparative everything, I think, is also good in terms of time management. Because when you build a problem that your opposing team also wants to solve, you are saving them time. You are saying you no longer need to solve this problem. So for example, if you are building, let's say it's an environment motion. I can't give a specific one right now, but in an environment motion and you explain climate change is the most important problem. It is something we all have to solve. Let's say it's not a motion that requires one side to defend the environment and the other side to say the economy is better. Let's just say it is two sides trying to fight for the best environmental solution. If that is the case, let's say it's something like this house would make all international environmental treaties binding. In that case, I think it becomes more of a debate about how do you protect the environment more through treaties, right? I suppose you could bring up the economic issue, but let's say both teams agree the environment is the most important thing to solve. In that case, if you're proving why climate change is urgent, why the environment is something that you would have to protect, the other side won't disagree. You've done them a favor by saying, sure, we agree, our solution is better. You would instead have to work around what are the unique problems that exist that the motion would be able to solve. So for example, on government of the binding side, I would say something like, not only are we unable in status quo to ensure countries are following up on their commitments, such as with the Paris deal, most countries have not reached their commitments, but also countries, like other countries, are less willing to opt into it if they can't trust other countries to do the same thing. So I would not opt into an agreement if I know the other countries around me that might be competing economically won't agree and they might renege at some point, and therefore they will not be able to be on the same competitive footing as us. In that instance, it becomes very difficult to have an agreement between countries and they're less likely to sign. So because of that, you have to build problems that the solution is uniquely able to solve rather than general problems of the theme of the motion, because I think that can be quite uncompelling. Also, it's just easier to logically link the motion as a solution, because if you're building specific problems, it's much easier to see, okay, here's why we solve it, rather than maybe more broader problems that have so many ways to go about the solution. Second is you want to build complete arguments. And I'm sure everyone knows you should build a problem, analysis, impacts and conclusion, as well as meta and framing. Conclusion if it's a principle, by the way. I don't think, not all, like most principles don't have an impact. But yeah, basically, you know what an argument should be. It's just, I feel like sometimes it's easy to forget and you want to basically have a mental checklist. Does it have all these things? So I think the importance of a problem, I'm not sure if this is commonly seen as part of an argument, but I think when you build a problem, it becomes a lot easier to explain what the value of the argument is, because you move it from pretty cool benefit to like perhaps a pretty essential solution for something. So for example, if it's this house would place a tax on sugary drinks or food, you could prove it and say people will drink and eat this stuff less and therefore people are healthier. It would be stronger if you could say something like, throughout the world, there are increasing rates of obesity. The common corporation has found ways to ensure they have incorporated themselves into the daily meal. That kind of stuff. So yeah, the common maybe cereal corporation, other kinds of sweets corporations that have basically turned American breakfast into dessert have been so integrated into daily life that you need to have some form of deterrence towards people eating these things. And I think when you build that problem, it kind of shows this is a much bigger problem and a much more necessary solution than just saying people become healthier, that's cool. Second is analysis. So don't immediately get into the argument when prepping. Make a mental map of what you need to prove first. So don't build the argument immediately is what I'm trying to say. Think, what do I have to prove for this argument to occur? So let's say the motion is this house will ban guns. You want to say it reduces crime. You can't just say, once we ban guns, people will use it less, and now there's less crime. You have to ask yourself, what are the different things that would require this argument to not only be true, but to be impactful/exclusive? So first is you have to prove the ban is going to be effective, right? If op can successfully prove some kind of black market argument that is less regulated, especially when we're talking about criminals, then perhaps you don't really get a unique benefit. Secondly, you have to prove regulation is insufficient. Because if op says that regulation is enough, people won't be able to access guns that are criminals, it's fine, only the people who will need it in self-defense will use it, then you also can't argue this anymore. You have to prove regulation doesn't work. Third, you have to explain why guns are used in crimes. So if you're going to reduce crime, what role does the gun play? So not just in shootings, perhaps, but maybe auxiliary crimes, right? Like robberies, the threat of violence being used and leveraged against someone in order to extort them for something. Lastly, you also have to prove why alternatives to guns don't have the same effect. So what if people swap the knives instead? Would that really reduce the amount of crime that's ongoing? So explaining this would be very impactful in ensuring that you have less crime, right? But you can't just build it all together. You have to create that kind of mental map and maybe ask yourself what are the questions op is going to raise in order to fully build a good argument here. Impacts. I think there are two things. One is be specific. I think reaching a broad impact like this good for the economy, not like very specific. I think it's hard to quantify or understand how valuable that is in a debate. But second is you want to understand how this is different from status quo. So you want to ask yourself who is affected, to what degree they're affected, how meaningful is it, but also how much does this change from the lives that they're currently living today. Second is you want to end at an uncontroversial claim, right? Because it might be easy for op to spin the argument and say, you know what, actually it's a bad thing. We don't want that. So for example, don't claim that X group is going to take power if it's unclear why that group is a good actor to take power, because it's maybe still a controversial claim. Or don't end with this gives more agency to X group if the other side is saying agency is okay to trade off maybe for some kind of material benefit. So the first claim, I think, is controversial because the other side is saying they're not a good group. Let's not give them that power. Second is it might not be morally justified. So the second claim, that this agency not worth whatever material benefit is offered to them. And therefore, you have to justify that instead. So if you're reaching impacts that are either unspecific or ones that are going to have some kind of contestation to them, I think you have to work on the next part, which is meta or framing. So there are two ways to go about it. I think you can frame it as a moral good, meaning why is this in itself a good thing? Does it impact a lot of people? Does it change their lives a lot? Is it for a very vulnerable group? So all these things that emphasize why this is good in itself, and then framing in the round. So maybe it beats a deadlock of an opening team. Maybe it was necessary to prove for your opening team's argument to fly, all that kind of stuff. So you want to assess these two different aspects of meta. Last is build with other teams in mind. And I think it's most important for OG. You want to think about not just preemption, because I feel like that's intuitive, but also, let's say you're second speaker, you're hearing your Prime Minister LO speech, and you're like, how could CGCO extend? Once you have that, it becomes a lot easier to think. I have to think of ways to thirst them out. I have to make sure they have nothing left standing. And if they do have something left standing, it's not going to be very convincing. So debate isn't just rebutting your opponent that is on the other side. It is a war of attrition with the closing team and making sure that you are like killing them off. Lastly, you want to look at what is your weak point, right? What is the way to frame you out of the debate? How can you adjust? Perhaps you can either counter that framing or pivot the case, add new material that is going to ensure that you don't fall out of the debate. So if there's an issue you haven't engaged in yet, other side says it's the most important issue in the round, start delving into that. Winning with adjustments. So I think a lot of debates are really just about once you see something, a strategic strength or flaw, how do you adjust? I put the Bear Grylls meme here just for fun. But I think it really is about, it's kind of like a Pokemon kind of thing, right? You have an argument type, a speaker type, and then some kind of way to counter them and the ability to think of a strategy that would counter them. So here's my mindset when I assess different cases, right? Sometimes you don't even have to hear the content of the case, just the way the case is structured, and then understanding what do I do from here on out. First, you want to understand your opponent's strengths or flaws. So in a 7-minute speech, it's, again, pretty impossible to do everything correctly. If your opponent is perfect, they have no mistakes, then great for them. Good luck beating them. But like I'd say 99.9% of the time, they're not going to do that. So to varying extents, you have to understand opponent's strengths and flaws and then capitalizing on that. What we're going to go through now is how to respond to and extend from these different strengths and flaws. Flaws first, so that's easier, but I guess the strengths might be more helpful. So flaw, let's say they have a negative case. They have no solution to status quo. When you're responding to a team like this, you don't just say they have no like counterfactual, no converse burden, and then end it there. You want to explain why in the absence of solving the problem that exists in status quo, it is far more important than the negative claims they're bringing up, i.e. maybe the solution you are proposing has some external harm. Maybe it's not a perfect solution, the motion is going to harm some group as a consequence of what it's trying to do. But I think what you could do then is explain why the problem you're solving and the degree to which you solve it is the most important thing in the round. And therefore, it beats off the harms the other team might propose. Secondly is, in extension, I think you might want to provide that positive solution, but make sure it is mutually exclusive. Because it might seem like you are saying, here's an alternative, rather than saying why the motion is bad. What you want to say is, here's an alternative. You can't do this on your side of the house as an alternative. Moreover, it is far better than what the motion is trying to do. And if you can explain why the motion is taking away from said alternative, that becomes a lot more beneficial. Then you'd want to explain why the harms or outlines perhaps are not very good harms, not the most compelling harms. The positive material in solving the problem is the most important thing in the debate. Small impact argument. In response, very easily trade it off. Say, sure, that's true. We don't care. This is more important. In extension, though, I think what you want to do is explain why the motion is influential, i.e., why the motion can change many different things. Because I think a small impact argument can be very strategic sometimes when the motion doesn't change very much. When you have a very low impact motion, I personally feel this a lot with things like pop culture motions. Like I think X celebrity, like, I don't know, I like those kinds of motions about X celebrity. They're not going to change the feminist movement. They're not going to change, I don't know, things at large. Perhaps some will, who knows, maybe for some celebrities. But I think especially if they're not that influential, if they're a one-time thing that will fade in the next 5 years, I would not have a very high impact argument on global politics, on a broader social movement. Perhaps tuning the argument to their fans might be the most important thing. However, if you can prove that the motion is more impactful than that in the instances where it is, saying this motion has a lot of changes, here's all the power this group has, this person has, here's why this would be massive, then explaining a high impact extension. Because I think just a high impact extension could lose to a low impact argument if it is one that doesn't have very much influence in terms of the actor that is going to do these two actions. For mechanisms. So first, I think you have to say, hold on. I think you have to say there is no proof of the impact. But then what you want to do is explain there are many other ways to achieve the impact. Because I think what that does is it makes it hard for them to adjust, right? Like let's say your LO, PM doesn't really mechanize the benefit. DPM could add those mechanisms, and then suddenly your rebuttal is not very meaningful. But you can instead do it LO as say, yeah, PM didn't really prove this, not very important. Then say, here are so many other reasons the harm they say could happen. It's not because of the motion. So even if DPM comes up with reasons to say the motion could contribute to the problem, perhaps it is such a small amount of contribution to the problem that it's not as important as what your case is going to be. In extension, obviously, you have to provide mechanisms, but because I think a team that has poor mechanisms probably is going to impact a lot, you want to have more specific impacts. So explain why they are directly derivative of the mechanisms you're espousing, rather than just saying the same things and that you prove it better. I think that also gives you more room on the extension, rather than just saying we provide the analysis. You can provide a much better argument on whole. No framing. First, I think when you're responding, you want to assess how intuitive this harm is. So let's say the team is saying this kills like 1,000,000 people. You don't really need to frame that, to be honest. Like that's a huge harm, and that I guess in a motion that might be very high impact, maybe it couldn't be, maybe it could be, who knows. But let's say it's something that's just so obviously a terrible thing, right? You don't want to think that that lack of framing means it's not important in the debate, because even then, I think you would have to outconstruct it. Because no judge is going to be like, well, they only said that it kills 1,000,000 people, therefore it's not that important. They didn't explain why that was a bad thing. I think that's obviously a bad thing. So if it is an intuitive, very believable, very impactful thing, you have to outconstruct them. You have to come up with an argument that is going to be just as good. But if not, you can outframe them. So obviously, if they're not framing, you have to explain why the argument isn't as important, why it is perhaps just one of many different issues, perhaps, again, why it doesn't have a very big impact. On extension, I think you might want to commit to another issue, because I think unlike a mech, where if the opening team doesn't provide mech and then you provide a mech, then you probably win. If the opening team doesn't provide framing and then you provide framing, I don't think you win, actually. Like some judges will credit it, and it obviously depends on the contribution. But if all you're doing is explaining why the opening team's argument is the most important argument in the round, you are whipping for them, not really winning the debate. So I think you might want to go all in on another issue that they have not touched on, and then frame that in, rather than providing some kind of framing for the argument they've already provided. I don't think it's the most compelling point of extension. Let's say they're unresponsive, right? What you want to do is create arguments independent of the main issue of you and that team if you're responding to them. And the reason for this is, let's say you're fighting over these two issues, right? And they're just not responding to you, you're responding to them. What you'd want to do is create an independent argument that does not require winning either of these two issues. It doesn't have to be the most important argument in the round, but it can serve as some kind of tiebreaker in that instance. Because if they leave it standing, what you can say is, obviously on these first two issues, we win. But let's say they construct really, really well, even if they're unresponsive. So they have good material there. You also are refuting that material and providing your own material. Then don't say it's a wash. Explain why the refutation disproves them. But explain then why this new argument that they are going to leave standing because they're not very responsive is then an incredibly important argument, therefore should win you that clash maybe in top half. Second, when you're extending, you want to explain why standing material from the other side is winning. So say, you know what, the other team did a good job. They proved this. The other team didn't respond. This is actually the most important thing. And then you jump in and start to respond. So it's not just that you respond to the other team, but you kind of want to build them up and say, if OG, for example, your CG, if OG doesn't disprove this from OO, then their claim is false. They lose. OO is the most important. If we disprove it, we go above them. And then not just saying it's responsive, but also constructing a case around it. So you can make it an extension. So it doesn't just seem like you're rebutting them. I honestly think the way you label things in a debate can heavily impact how it's credited. So getting stuck in this whole rebuttal constructive distinction, I think, not very meaningful. Explaining what your contribution is doing, maybe it's constructive, and in that constructive, you're responding to another team, I think is much more meaningful in terms of how you weigh it in a debate. That said, that's why I don't like labeling what I'm doing necessarily, because I signpost for sure. I'm saying what topic I'm talking about and how I'm going about it. But I do think that, I don't know, you might not want to be as strict in terms of these distinctions because they might go undercredited in some instances. Now we're going to talk about strengths and how do you adjust to the strengths of another team. First, if they have a lot of arguments, there are two options in response. One is you can meet them. Sometimes this is necessary. I think a lot of people say you don't want to respond to everything, that kind of stuff. I think sometimes you do. Not all the time, but let's say they are fairly well built, they are fairly argued, they're all quite important. You do have to meet them in some of these instances, especially if you have material that would meet them and counter them in those cases. But secondly, is you want to select and weigh specific issues. Let's say they argue four things, they won't have enough time for all that, right? The third and fourth argument especially might go undercredited. You might want to say first two arguments contribute to the most important issue. Doesn't mean you don't respond to the third and fourth thing. Let's say drop it. No. You want to talk about the third and fourth thing and then explain why they are not of much value in the round and then start to win the first and second thing. So minimize the debate, exclude what is the least important, and then try to win on the more minimal aspect of the debate that you've created. I think is a very strategic option for this in some instances as well. Extension. You want to analyze the most important argument that they give. Because if you're spending, let's say you have four arguments at LO, I've encountered speakers who have extended for four arguments at LO. It's not fun. But what you'll notice is that four arguments in 7 minutes with a 1 minute setup leaves about a minute 30 for every argument. There's something they're going to miss out on. And you want to see of the important arguments they're going to have, what is it that they're missing out on? So can you go more macro? Can you go more micro in your analysis? Can you perhaps introduce an actor that is quite important? Could you explain maybe the impact they thought of was not that big of an impact? They just had very good analysis for it. And then explain what are the possible impacts? How can the motion be used? And more than that, you don't just want to explain what you add new to the argument, but also explain deficiencies in the framing or proof. Because when you are running so many different things, it's hard to have picture perfect everything. And also, though, it might be hard for judges to pick up on those flaws, especially if they're a good speaker, where the flaws won't be so evident. I'm not even just saying this is a rep thing. I'm saying this as I think a lot of good speakers can run a lot of good material, but the flaws are going to be there, just in very, very small and sneaky ways that I think you would have to have a very good scent for. Like perhaps the ability to sniff it out. And then bring it out, explain, you know what, here's a small thing that they thought was a small thing. It's actually quite important. Let's deal with it. Teams that trade off very well. So there are a lot of teams, I think, say, you know what, they have A, we have B, B is better than A. I think when you're responding to that, you want to do really well at refutation. Because if they say goal B is more important than goal A, I'd say one of the keys there is to say, you know what, they don't even achieve goal B. They are skipping to the point where they assume they achieve their benefit or harm, and they are weighing it. Do not let them, do not believe them. They don't even get there. This is not a debate about this or that. It's a debate about who's even more likely to get there to begin with. It's not that. But when you're extending, there are two things you can do. The first is you can flesh out the impact. So if they say B is more important than A, perhaps they are comparing B relatively to A, but they don't really explain how important B is. So I think really fully fleshing out what this end outcome is and then explaining how crucial it is to the round could make a big difference. Secondly, is you could just co-op, right? If they say, you know what, goal B more important than goal A, we'll say we also get goal A on our side of the house. Quite a good strategy because both, I'd say, is better than just one. Teams that refute very well. So I think firstly, there's a necessity to reconstruct because if they refute you and you don't achieve your benefits, it's not like you can just leave that standing and there's another strategy there. But the ways to adjust to make it easier are one, use their premises. Because if you are spinning characterizations against them, they can't backtrack and say, you know what? No, 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 we were wrong. We don't believe you. So using their premises gives them less room for refutation and therefore allows you to build the logical links in ways that they cannot always just refute, or else they start confusing the stance. And therefore, when you're reconstructing, it becomes a lot easier because you have less of a threat of refutation. But secondly, is you want to weigh the most intuitive or exclusive claims of the debate. So let's say the debate has perhaps a benefit that is very clear for both sides. Let's say the motion is something like this house would allow government access to all encrypted messages. Not sure how balanced that is, but I think definitely opposition has the benefit of privacy and perhaps could even argue some kind of national security argument on why privacy is better at dealing with that. But I think what you could say then is perhaps being able to explain why privacy is more important than this broad ability to maybe service national security. And it's a right you can't take away for that common good is something then you can't just refute, right? On Gov, you can't just refute that OP has no privacy because they're to a comparative extent more likely to achieve that kind of privacy. In extension though, you want to build more positive material because if they're always saying they won't achieve this, they don't get this thing, they will not reach this goal, they often aren't able to reach the point where they're proving positively how does your side reach that then? Not just your own goal, but perhaps maybe solving a problem, etc. So being able to focus on the positive aspect of the debate, because refutation by nature often leads to more negative aspects of the debate, could be quite a good winning strategy. Thank you so much for listening. I hope this was helpful. And I think that, I guess a lot of this is really just awareness. I think these are things that I had realized over time that I was doing, but while I was doing them, I didn't really know. So I think being able to check yourself for these things, being more active and aware, and especially during the duration of the debate, this is a very helpful mindset to put yourself at. Always thinking, always being on your feet. Thank you so much.